Welcome to week two. This week, we're going to continue with a very broad look at all of these amendments and submissions that we're talking about in the course to gain a sense of how does this fit together? What is the legislative history that led to a lot of these amendments and submissions? And that way we have a sense of how things used to be and what the FDA and what Congress was attempting to remedy. And I think that will really provide the context and the insight when we get into specific submissions about why things occur a certain way or why certain information is required. All of this background and how these pieces fit together will really be helpful. So today is all about overview of the entire framework and legislative history, and we'll start with taking a look at where we left off last week. And last week we said all the pieces that fit together begin by asking, is it food? Is it even subject to FDA or FSIS regulation? Here, when we're talking about a lot of the provisions, we're talking about the FDA, which has the primary control. And in the FDA realm, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, we're asking if it's added. A lot of the provisions that we're talking about apply to added substances. We can get into a further concept of food additive, a specific type of added substance. From there, we can get even more specific and talk about whether or not the GRAS exemption applies. And we can get into all the key aspects of labeling to ensure that we're not undoing all of our work to identify the appropriate regulatory pathway, and finally identifying those final steps to entry, such as facility registration and other aspects that we're talking about. So all of this fits together, and as I mentioned last week and we talked about in the discussion board, a lot of this is questions about how to bypass the FDA. Now, this is very different than when we talk about medical device, when we talk about drug, where we can't get past that first definitional issue, is it a drug, is it a medical device, without having to go to the agency for some feedback, some type of approval. So submissions for food are unique, they're rare, they're not used that often, and part of that is some of the changes that we'll talk about today that allowed the FDA to push some of that burden onto the industry and allow industry to find ways to bypass the agency. So one of the first things we'll talk about is identity standards, standards of identity, referring to the same thing. And as you recall from the Intro to Food Law course, we talked about this a lot in the context of economic adulteration, and that was the primary purpose, the primary corrective measure in the 1938 Act with this concept of standards of identity. In the 1906 Act, there was a control of economic adulteration, which is essentially the use of inferior ingredients without disclosure. The example we gave in the Introduction to Food Law course was blueberry bits that are claimed on the label as blueberries, and there's a number of lawsuits related to this. Pinnacle Foods was sued for their Aunt Jemima brand of, I think it was waffles or pancakes that said blueberry waffles, for example, but they actually contained blueberry bits. Other types of economic adulteration are provided in the 1938 Act, our current act. In the 1906 Act, the drafters attempted to mitigate or provide some shelter to those economic adulteration actions by providing provisions in the misbranding section of the Act that said if you use a distinctive name or if you state that you're imitation and some other words like compound, then you're not subject to economic adulteration attacks. This led to a huge mess in the courts about whether it was a distinctive name and what kind of distinctive name, and whether if it said imitation but it contained one artificial ingredient, was that sufficient to meet the component of exemption that was in the misbranding. A lot of litigation, a lot of work. It was a mess, and so it just didn't work, and it didn't work in the way the drafters intended. So standards of identity came in to fix all of this. It came in to put an end to the litigation, to provide a uniformity and a consistency to how the agency, how the FDA could come in and regulate products that contained different ingredients than what was on the label. So the example we gave last week, you're not quite peanut butter, you're not quite jelly, you're bread spread, and you can have any imaginable ingredients in there, even though you're competing with true peanut butter or true jelly that may actually contain what you would expect. So standards of identity required uh, the establishment of certain ones, and there was a big kickoff in 1954 with standards of 1938. We see this, and in 1954 we start to see a lot of these created. And we have a ton of these now. Everything from sherbet ice cream to anything you can imagine has a standard of identity. It tells you how to label it. It tells you what it can contain and to what level. And as one of the submissions that we'll get into is we can apply for a new standard of identity. But in lieu of that, we can just use the common or usual name or a name that is not confusing. So this allows the FDA to completely bypass the courts. They don't have to go and gain evidence that shows the type of name that you're using, why it's confusing, why it's not a distinctive name, or why it's not a compound. They can just say, here's the CFR that provides the standard of identity for your sherbet ice cream as an example. And here's how your product isn't labeled that appropriately with that regulation, or here's how your product doesn't meet that formulation. Incredibly clear and incredibly easy for the FDA to now conduct enforcement actions. And so this is one of those examples where the solution was to fix a problem, and it really was a pretty messy problem that persisted for almost 25 years. The food additive regulations didn't exist for 20 years with the new act, our current act, the 1938 one, and wasn't a component at all in the 1906 Act. So it was a really new concept that we see in 1958. And prior to this, the primary mechanism for new added substances, and that's the best that you can call them because they're not food additives. It's not a term until until after the amendment. So these new added substances were controlled primarily post-market, and you typically don't learn about novel substances unless there's a crisis. So you see a number of instances where someone gets sick, school children. There's an example in the 1950s, 54, where Halloween candy with some additives in it, mostly linked to color additives, caused a ton of kids to get ill. The FDA had no idea about the use of the additive, its safety, and it really destroys public confidence that you don't know what's out there and you don't know how safe it is, and the regulators aren't able to effectively control the market. It also stifles innovation. You can be this great manufacturer, you've got chemists in-house, you're developing new added substances that are great preservatives, whatever the purpose is of this new ingredient, new flavoring agent, sweeteners, and then you put it on the market, you put all this investment, this R&D dollars into it, and then the FDA comes back because there's been an adverse event and tries to completely prohibit its use. That really stifles innovation in addition to those elements of weakening public confidence. And so the system didn't work. It just was not effective. And it was, I mentioned last week, it was interesting if you look back at the House hearing records, the House of Representatives that was conducting, the panel that was conducting the investigation kept pressing the FDA, how many food added substances, novel substances are on the market? And the agency just could not give the panel a number because they had no way to know what was on the market. So food additives completely shifts that burden. Now the manufacturer and industry has to come to the FDA and say, look, our product is safe and here's why it's safe. And we'll get into that when we get into GRAS and when we get into food additive submissions about the safety requirements related to those. So all that cost and experts and analysis and evaluation of these ingredients and proving that they're safe, which ultimately the brands have a vested interest in doing to protect their brand, is now put onto industry, whereas before that would have been on the agency in a post-market setting, typically a seizure, some sort of action where they're coming in court either to condemn the product, destroy it, and proving that it's not safe. So it's a complete flip of the paradigm that existed prior to 1958. Color additive regulations, same thing, very similar issue. the estimates at the time that the 1960 amendment came into place is that there were over 200 colors in use, and it's really dramatic to look at the legislative history, including some court cases where the number of additives after the amendment were provisionally listed, meaning since they were already approved, we're going to keep them listed as color additives, but we're going to reevaluate their safety. That number of additives just started falling like flies, and not a lot of those survived. There was a lot of challenges about certain ones. We'll talk about the Delaney clauses and the prohibition against carcinogenic color additives, food additives, and animal drugs. There was a lot of challenge to ban some of these because they were known occupational hazards. You could go in and other agencies like OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Hazard, would come in and they would know that the workers who had worked with these color additives would have rashes on their hands. But there was no ability to share that information with the FDA, and there was no ability for the FDA to do anything about that unless a consumer became ill from that color additive. And so it was all post-market enforcement, and it was all reactive, only reactive to crisis, and only in crisis did they really learn what color additives were on the market and what those color additives consisted of. This is damaging to public confidence, which is one of the primary purposes of these acts. And we went back and look at 1906, and we look at why the Federal Meat Inspection Act was passed, why the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. It was all about fixing an outcry that had really damaged the market and had destroyed public confidence in the safety of food. And we're witnessing all of this in an arc of history following the post-Civil War, where American food was largely produced on the farm within a certain mile radius. You knew where your food came from. And suddenly, through progression of history, and especially following World War I and II, we see this rapid industrialization of food, where it's occurring far away from you in a factory that you have no sense of what they're doing, what they're adding to your food. And so for the agency that's primarily in charge of regulating this to also not have any clue when that's their primary mission really is damaging to the public confidence. And so something had to be done to restore that public confidence. And again, the solution was to shift the burden of proving safety off of the FDA onto industry, so that industry now has to come back and say we're either in compliance with the listing, or here's our safety data and some other information that we'll talk about in a petition about why we are eligible to be a new listed color. And so again, public confidence, innovation, consistency are all elements that we're seeing again in this amendment. So I like to call these the adulteration amendments because they're all related to an added substance, and they're all in reaction not only to providing some sense of what's happening in the market and getting the FDA more engaged and active in that, but also in easing the FDA's burden. We've talked about it last week, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning of this presentation. The criteria for added substances under the may render injurious standard both requires the FDA to collect evidence prior to proving that standard, and then has to go to court and meet that evidentiary burden. So now we're talking about no evidence collection, no evidence standards. The FDA now is setting those evidentiary standards and telling industry, okay, you want to use this new added substance, whether we call it a food additive, whether we call it a color additive, or some of these others that we'll look at. Here's the level of information you need to provide us, and we'll review it. So it's a complete shift. It encourages innovation, in part because you can go and spend these R&D dollars, develop this great new preservative, go to the agency, and either learn about what levels it can be used in, what intended uses it can be used for, if there needs to be particular disclaimers, all of those sort of things, so you can get it to market and know that the FDA is not going to come back and pull it from the market absent some extraordinary circumstances. And the Delaney clause could be one of those where it's found to induce cancer. But for the most part, you know you're going to be able to enter the market and sell and not have the agency come back and pull you from the market. It protects the public. Again, we're talking about giving the buying public that confidence that when they read the label, that those ingredients that they see are known to the agency. The agency at least has had some opportunity to evaluate those or to know that those comply with some regulations. So we're protecting the public. We're still going to have incidents of food fraud where ingredients don't go through this process or fraudulently declare that they're one thing but they're actually another. Melamine is one example of that. So we can't completely protect the public, but we can at least through the regulations give the public that confidence that there is an enforcement and pre-market process in place that should catch a lot of this. Maybe we can't even say the majority. We can't at least say that there's something in place to catch this and hopefully catch the majority. So that's the good. The bad is it's complex. And I debated whether or not to put up a decision type hierarchy tree here, and I go back and forth because it's so complicated. It's more daunting to put up than just to say it's complicated, because you have so many thresholds that you're trying to go through. You're trying to assess, is it added? Is it not added? If it is added, does it go through a particular set of amendments, or does it go through something else? There's just so many questions that you go through in this, and it's in part because all of this was done in a piecemeal approach. There was never this concept that, like we saw in the 1938 Act, where we're going to address all of the issues that are currently in the market into one system. That happened once in the 1938 Act, and then everything else happened subsequent without addressing what it was changing. So we kind of have this sandwich, this mix of amendments sitting on top of other amendments where they kind of displace this provision but don't directly repeal this other provision. It creates a really complex maze. Animal drug approval is unique, and I like to put it after some of the other adulteration amendments, and not only because it came later, 1968, about 8 years after the last amendment, but because it wasn't about safety. It really was about providing a unified, simplified process for animal drug approval to go through. And here we're talking about animal products that will end up for human consumption that may have a drug residue on them. Previously, they would be subject to a new drug approval through the Center for Veterinary Medicine, the CVM. So that would take into consideration all those aspects of new drug approvals, safety, efficacy, all of that type of thing. Prior to 1958, it would have asked, is this new drug have the potential to be added, an added substance to the food product in the end? Again, looking at drug residues and whether that would qualify for added, whether that may be subject to a tolerance, most likely not, whether it would be otherwise considered adulterated under the 1938 Act. We had the 1958 amendment, the food additive amendment. So now we're asking this question in the drug approval process. Okay, so CVM needs to determine that based on the safety and efficacy, it's appropriate for use in the animal. Now we need to send it over to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition and ask that center whether it's going to leave a residue, and that residue is going to be in compliance with the food additive amendment criteria. Is it going to be GRAS? Likely not. Is it going to require a new food additive petition? Most likely. And how do you're sending this facility through a non-parallel process? You're kind of tracing it across the centers in the FDA. And as I mentioned, a lot of these amendments are already created a complicated system. So a complicated system within a complicated system is nobody's friend. And that was the driving force behind this amendment. And so now we have a unified system. Every time there's a new drug request for a food-producing animal, the Center for Veterinary Medicine, the CVM, can look at all those layers, and in particular look at the residues both through the added and through the food additive, more often than not through the food additive lens, to determine whether that residue is going to be in violation of the amendment. Consider the Laney Clause issues. The Laney Clause is added to the Animal Drug Amendment here. So all of this was about unification and simplification. whereas some of the other amendments, the food additive, color additive, we have the pesticide residue amendment, which we haven't talked about for raw agricultural commodities. All of those were about safety and having substances become components of food that we weren't quite comfortable or weren't sure if those were going to be safe. Here we're just talking about making the regulatory process easier on the agency. Claims regulation before NELA 1990-1991 is real interesting to look at because everything came through the misbranding provisions of the Act. There was no authorization of any type of claims. We did not have a distinction about health claims, authorization for nutrient content claims, no discussion or guidance on structure function claims. Simply the question was, is the claim misleading? And that was no authorization, so again, all post-market. And that was typically done through agency attempts to regulate and often challenges to those agency attempts. So we had no authorization for any of the types of claims we're familiar with, and we'll give an example in the next slide about claims that would seem very familiar to us here in the current regulatory landscape that were completely prohibited. So post-market enforcement is not always the preferred way to conduct some of these activities, but that was the primary mode for the agency at the time. And so we had, if you were in Nebraska and you went to courts in that circuit, you may get one answer. And if you went in New Mexico and you went to the courts of that circuit, you get another answer. So it was no predictability, no uniformity, and the claims varied. It's not any in industry, you can imagine it's not the way you want to do business. Is depending on what circuit you're gonna have packaging and marketing for the courts of that circuit, not what you want to do. So like I mentioned, a lot of the claims that were taken for granted, completely violative. Continental Baking Company, this is one of those times I wish we were in person because I could ask if anyone knows about Continental Baking Company. Continental Baking Company is the conglomerate that owned a lot of manufacturing brands and facilities and produced a lot of products. But they were the original maker of the Twinkie, and that's why we have the Twinkie image here. But they were also the first maker of fortified bread, and something that we kind of take for granted. A lot of our conventional foods are fortified, but that wasn't always the case. And with fortification, of course, comes claims. You're not going to add these ingredients to the product unless you're going to claim that it does something better than your competitor that doesn't have that fortification. And so Continental created this new bread product, misspelling on the slide here, sorry. This new bread product that was called Fresh Horizons Bread. And it was fortified, the first to be fortified, and it claimed fewer calories. And looking at this claim, it would seem to fit on any packaging we could find in the store today. 30% fewer calories than white bread. It also had a higher in fiber claim. This claim we probably could see on packaging today, but we would immediately, both as consumers, say this one is rubbish, and also as regulatory professionals say this claim probably is not going to fly with the FDA. Their claim stated that they had 400% more fiber than whole wheat bread. So they had some additional verbiage to what these distilled claims were. They had some very strong paragraphs in the front of the packaging talking about how the American diet needed roughage and how if you were looking to watch your waistline, that this bread had fewer calories. They also included a brochure that explained the role of fiber, talking about gastrointestinal disorders and digestive problems. A lot of things that we would just kind of expect to see in a health store, or we could kind of just describe as general scientific dietary information. So they had that on the packaging and in this pamphlet. And amazingly enough, even in just looking at the fewer calories claim, the FDA determined in an enforcement action that this bread product was an illegal new drug. And it's right along the lines of what we've seen so often with reclassification under the intended use. This was in 1976, so it was going to be pre-Nutrilab, where we would get that intended use concept, but it's still going to be right along those lines where the FDA is looking at the claims and determining, okay, is this a food product? Is this a drug product? And what they determined was that these claims pushed the product into the drug category because they suggested that they were useful in the prevention of diseases such as obesity, uh, heart disease, and some of these gastrointestinal ailments that the product mentioned. Based on that packaging, the FDA determined illegal new drugs. So it's pretty amazing to think, because we do not have an authorization of nutrient content claims, which a lot of, these two examples are nutrient content claims. Some of the others relating to gastrointestinal probably going to fall under the health claim. They go a little bit further, maybe into structure function. So misbranding and NELA really were needed. They brought uniformity. Now we know when we get nutrient content, it's in the regulations, it's tied to daily values. We have a way to understand that context of what it means to be a good source of, to be light, to be higher in, less than, low. All of these terms that we just see all the time on packaging now have uniform meaning. Consistency, not only consistency in that we know how to make these health claims, and we know what standard that we have to show to make a health claim, or what standard we need to show to get a new nutrient content claim, but also consistency in making the claim and knowing that if we comply with these standards, the agency isn't going to come back and say that this is a new drug and reclassify the product. We can make these health claims, we can make these nutrient content claims and not be new drugs, and that's really important. Predictability, again, providing boundaries to where we can expect enforcement actions, ensuring that enforcement actions are consistent throughout the agency. So if you're in the Los Angeles district office and not in one of the Florida field offices, that you're going to get a different result. If you follow the regulations, or you go through the approval process and you do the right notification or submission, you know that you're going to be fine. It also gives consumer confidence. You can imagine being a shopper in that period of time and trying to evaluate and figure out, okay, I'm looking at this product and it says it has 30% fewer calories, or it has 400% more fiber. 400% more fiber than what? 30% more calories than what? Okay, we have this reference to white bread and to whole wheat bread, but what's our baseline that we're looking at? And so now, as consumers, and some consumers, a lot of consumers, I would say, simply take this for granted, but it's there in the market, and we would notice it if it was gone. We have this meaning now to what these claims mean, what these definitions will hold the product to. And so I think that's something that is underneath all of these claims and underneath all of these amendments, is how do we see them not as regulatory professionals, but how do we see them as consumers? So that wraps up our discussion for the second week. Next week, we're going to start getting into the details of certain submissions. We're going to start with, I believe, GRAS is going to be our first look at how we claim and make a GRAS determination. But for this week, this was our overview. We're going to get a sense of the legislative history, get a sense of what was the motivation behind a lot of these acts, and then we're going to channel that into our discussion for this week and look at what I'd really like for this to be an opportunity for us to step back from our experience. If we've been in a facility for a while and we've been doing these submissions, or been familiar with these submissions, familiar with these claims, is to step back and remember when we were just an ordinary consumer, and gain a sense of how we view a lot of this history, a lot of these provisions, and how that makes us feel. And there's some specific points that I want to raise in the discussion that are there in the discussion board. But that's something I'd like for you to do, and I know so often, and it's really excellent to have, is to have your experience regulating in this regulatory environment, making these determinations and working on these submissions or working in these particular topics. But I think it's important, as we saw, so much of this is about providing consumer confidence and consumer assurance, is how we can kind of view the FDA's role from that consumer perspective. So that's it for this week, and we'll pick up next week with GRAS.